Hello, I'm Bill Wilson for Tellstar News. We're really delighted today to have two outstanding guests, two political war horses in the state of Minnesota. Senator Eugene.McCarthy, former U.S. Senator from the state of Minnesota, and Miles Lard, retired federal judge from Minnesota. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, Bill.
Thank you.
This is as history has it, that you two gentlemen probably did more together as a team to shape the political landscape of Minnesota than any other two individuals. This is phenomenal.
Well, we had a little support from Hubert Humphrey, but, but we were all part of it,
Yes.
true.
We did it often not by joining with the mainstream, but by separating and doing it by a bit of dissent. And then the mainstream would, on occasion,
Seek
come
out.
and join us.
Yes. Outstanding. Senator, we had, there are a number of subjects we could cover, but one in particular that we're interested in is the whole issue of the war game, the issue of the citizen army versus the professional army. Do you have any thoughts on this subject?
Well, I do have. I was not in the Senate when they allowed the draft law to retire, but I was on record as continuing the citizens' army with rather good support. You know, Thomas Jefferson advocated universal military service, and he went back to the Greek city-state saying that as long as they had citizens' army, there was some control and concern. And Hamilton said, no, let's have a mercenary army. And neither one prevailed until 1970 and Richard Nixon, at which time the Hamilton position took over. And what we've had, in effect, has been a mercenary army since the middle 70s. And this is the first war, this one, in which we've fought it with what in effect was a mercenary non-citizens army. And I think Jefferson's concern, we haven't realized yet the danger of it. But in my mind, one of if you need a lesson out of a war, the one out of this is that we really ought to be concerned about the power of the military now, since it has tremendous military and economic power, but also it's been insulated from public judgment.
How might we open discussions up on that issue? Because it seems to be that on one level people are somewhat satisfied, but as the judge said, maybe issues of dissent need to be brought forward on the subject. But how might we engage that debate?
I don't know how you get people to look at these things unless there's some bad experience with it. When it was debated, there were two arguments made. There were the pro-war people said, let's have an army that's hired and paid for and wants to fight, so nobody will come along and say we shouldn't be in this war. The people who should have opposed the establishment of the so-called all-volunteer army said, well, this is fine. If there's a war that we don't like, we won't have to fight it. So the whole thrust of it was to remove military action from political and social judgment.
Judge, you have any thoughts on this subject?
Yes, there's a tug of war between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have-nots. To take all the poor kids and give them the only job they can find and put them in the army to do the fighting for us, lets the so-called upper crust, or the top economic and social people, escape really the horrors of war. And they really are the movers and the shakers in this country, whether you like it or not. You can go out and rabble-rouse with the poor and the downtrodden, but you need a few of those people that control society to help you. And if they don't stop a war, if they don't have a stake in it, or losing their own kids, then, as Senator McCarthy says, the president can send our troops any place for any reason without any dissent.
That is if I might just reflect on that for a moment, just remind me of a statistic that I came across that with respect to the African American community, that there are about as many young men in military service as there are in post-secondary education. That speaks to the point you're making.
Miles is quite right. And you know, McNamara, when he was Secretary of Defense, talked about the military as an instrument through which you could get some upward mobility, and you get some, but it has some other serious social consequences. It fits into a larger matter of concern. In our society, we really don't have any place, especially for young men and especially young black males, but people between the ages of about 18 and 21 or 22, unless they can go to college or go to the military, there's really nothing for them to do except deliver fast food. You know, you can If you're women, you can work at McDonald's. If you're men, you can work for Domino's Pizza.
If you've got a lot of courage to drive
Yeah,
fast.
that's right. But this takes care of maybe half of them. The rest of them are like it's sort of animal stuff. We sort of reject in the way the lions do. And people talk about the young lions as though young lions, but young lions are bad medicine. I mean, they're out there in the desert looking for trouble. And we in our society we're as primitive as lions are in terms of how we deal with this whole, the earlier society, there were apprenticeships, and there were squires who went with the knights. There was a place to go. In our society, you just cut them out and say, good for you, we'll see you when you're 23 or 24 if you're not in jail.
There's a double whammy to it also, because at the very age where these kids should be getting some subsidies to go to college, we tell them their only alternative is to go to the military. And when it comes to fight, who cares if we lose a few black kids or Hispanics and that? The people that really run this country don't have that same passion as if it were their own children.
De Tocqueville warns against this very thing of a military, he said, which is too big for what you need, or which is made up of personnel which is different from the general society. And the danger is, he says, that it becomes a force within the republic itself and can become the dominating force. And he didn't ever anticipate a time when we'd have a military force of the magnitude of what we have, and especially one which is more and more separate from social control.
We have to look out for that too. It's a very well-founded fear. Actually, as you read back at what happened about the time of Watergate, the top people in the Pentagon were ready for Nixon to take over the country. They were afraid of it. They were not going to obey his orders. He was drinking in the White House. There's lots of reasons for being crazy in the White House besides drinking. And we've got that kind of person in there with an army that doesn't have the breadth of contact with the general populace. They could turn it against us.
How do we bring that middle
so
class?
Easy, like the people say, why don't we use the army to control the drug traffic?
Sure.
Once you get the military controlling a civilian problem,
Absolutely.
it's a very easy stage for them to say, look, why don't we, this enthusiasm about running Schwarzkopf for president. Why? Nobody knows whether Schwarzkopf's got a flicker of an idea about social disorder in a society or about economics. I'm going to say, let's have a general,
How do we then draw this middle class back into this debate, realizing, Judge, as you point out, that unless they're part of it, not only the debate, but also providing the service, being part of the military, that this army could, in fact, be further isolated, and the kinds of concerns we were talking about can be very real. How do we get that?
I'm a good one at problems, but at solutions, I turn it over to Senator McCarthy.
Well, actually, Miles, you on the bench, you dealt with it in some of the case of conscientious objection to the Vietnam War, and you had to deal with which was essentially a social problem, in that the Johnson administration, the Nixon one, corrupted the draft. By granting exclusion. So they then said, well, the draft doesn't work. The draft would work. An honest draft would work. Did in World War II. And you had a military then which was a cross-section of the whole society, because they were all there. As they began to corrupt the draft because of Vietnam not wanting to take or not having the middle-class intellectuals have to send their, you could go to law school, you could go to graduate school, as long as you could stay in school. Why, you were free of the draft, and it developed, well, in itself it was hypocritical, but it developed a kind of lack of conscience which made it easy for people to say, let's have the all-volunteer mercenary army. And these subtle things take over rather subtly in a society, and once they become sort of institutionalized or beyond reflective judgment, as they should have been judged, then real trouble can follow from it. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a military man, and I said, how did you have a guy like Calley in charge of the company that killed the 128 at My Lai? He said, well, he was about the best quality we had in the military at that time. He said, in World War II, someone like Calley would not have been head of a company. Or even if he was, there would have been some fellows in the company who would say, look, Captain, we're not going to do this. But he said in Callie's case, there was nobody to say no.
Sure.
There was one person who, when the order was to take care of these people, didn't understand it, and the commanding officer came back and said, I thought I told you to take care of these people. And he said, here they are. He said, give me the gun. And at that point, supposedly, the soldier said, you mean kill him? He said, that's right. It was the first time the word kill had been used in a whole order of command over My Lai. There was a general order which said, this is a free fire zone, which meant you could shoot anybody. There was another general order which said, don't generate any prisoners. And this is the corruption of the language that went with it, until it got down to the kind of person who was in the army then, who didn't really know how to challenge a superior's order on something like a massacre.
For all of the discussion that Senator McCarthy had about the Vietnam War, all of the objections he made to it, all the criticism that's been made to that war about just devastating a country and then leaving it, we've done the same thing in Iraq. Exactly the same thing, maybe worse, because the people there are more sophisticated, their weapons are more sophisticated, so we went in and risked our lives and our reputation for what? I thought, at first I was sort of in favor of what Bush was doing. When I saw how he turned and ran from it, I've shifted the subject a little bit, I know that, but
well, it
serves discussion.
It's not really a shift, because he has sort of tried to relate this war and compare it to Vietnam as though this was something altogether different. And it isn't that different. In Miles said, what's been left is just about as, actually it's more confused and more disturbed society than what we left in Vietnam, where the differences were fairly well defined. Now you have Kurds and Shiites and Sunnis and whatever else they've gotten. And we have just really destroyed what little kind of substantial structure there was, not just economic, but political and social, and left it in something approaching chaos. And George has walked away from it, you know, to say, well, it was sort of indicated in some of his language. I've gotten so I kind of watched the language of presidents, but in the early, when the thing was building up, there was one press conference he held in a golf course. He was in the cart, and he was playing this thing. Well, this is not serious. He said, he said, I do this to recreate, which is something no one else had done. It was a new word that he'd created, recreate. And he said, I want everybody to recreate. He said, how do you do that? But he was indicating that this was not a very serious act that he was into, and he was going to go on playing golf. And as the press continued to kind of push him, since he allowed them to question him, he said, he got to run now. And this is sort of what he's saying in Iraq. You know, well, I got to run now. This is something it's here, but, and I never told the Kurds I was going to help. I just said, you know, it'd be a good idea if you Kurds did something. And it's like Czechoslovakia or Hungary. If you're revolutionaries and you get to hoping that you're going to get help from somebody like the United States, you begin to believe it's going to come. And we had a little of this in Chicago in '68 at the time of the Czechoslovakian uprising, and
yes,
Lyndon Johnson, they called Rusk back, and they alerted the troops and the reserves, and they asked me what I would have done if I'd been. I said, well, I would have gone to bed, and we'd have had a meeting the next morning. But to pretend you were going to do something which would encourage these Czechs to say, okay, they're going to come to help us. It was just what old Dulles did in the Hungarian thing. They thought we were coming.
Well, in Cuba we did it.
And the Cubans who got killed. And but to say that the Kurds shouldn't have responded is just ludicrous, you know.
Of course, there's some indication that even with Hussein, that there was some indication that he may have been somewhat encouraged to go forward.
Oh, I think so.
Be any strong
Saddam.
Opposition. Saddam, yes.
Yeah. In Kuwait.
In Kuwait, right, to go forward.
Well, the State Department spokesman, what was her name? April Glaske, made an interesting defense. She said that Their only mistake was that they didn't think Saddam was as dumb as he was. And I talked to Miles and said, I'd like to have been there to question her, saying, did you not know it because you were dumber than he was dumb? Or are you people so smart in the State Department that there's a certain level of intelligence below which you don't recognize dumbness? And if this is the case, I think I could understand a lot of mistakes you've made in the past, but I didn't know there was this area in which the dumbness factor took over and you didn't feel responsible for not identifying it.
Do you know that they're now talking about Schwarzkopf running for something? Everybody wants to elect him. My candidate would be Powell.
Oh, he'd be much better than Schwarzkopf.
Yeah, he had the courage to try to wait a little bit and to
he'd
look
had
this over.
experience as chairman of the Joint Chiefs is a somewhat political experience, but to run just a field operation, which is what Schwarzkopf did.
Of course, I'd run Powell just after I ran McCarthy.
Oh, I see. Well, we could run together. He could be number one, I could be number two. Either way, it'd be all right.
Well, we wouldn't want the vice president to be dumber than the president.
Well, I've always felt, Miles, that if I'd been nominated, I would have you should try to pick a vice president who's smarter than you are and better than you are. In fact, I once proposed that the convention should nominate the vice president and then let him pick the presidential candidate. There's a lot of elements of subtlety in that, but you'd have a modest man, and he'd say, well, I'll run for vice president. I won't be president, but I'll pick the president, and I'll take the second spot. That we ought to give a lot more thought to the vice presidency and the presidency than we have, I think, and sort of define what its function is. And,
of course, I'm for the smoke-filled rooms.
Well, I've had reservations about George Bush before he ran. I wrote a piece in '87 in which I listed some of the persons who shouldn't be considered for the presidency. And one was vice presidents. I thought they were probably the least qualified. But I also included heads of the CIA, past heads of the CIA, on the grounds that their experience is dangerous, And all these CIA guys that come out, whether it's Hunt or Liddy, they don't know the difference between being out and in. We're less careful about former CIA members than we were, and they're more dangerous than the Canine Corps. If you remember, after the war was over, and they talked about what do you do with the Canine Corps, they said, well, a lot of them you can't let out. Yep. And some of them you can recondition, and the rest of them you just got to hold them, But we take these CIA guys and turn them loose without any reconditioning, and without telling them or getting them convinced that this is a new world outside. You can't act outside the way you could when you were inside.
Even those who run for president?
Well, I think there's some evidence that Bush is tempted to do this kind of CIA sort of stuff or to tolerate it.
How phony it was when he said, we're not trying to remove the man from office. We're not going to send a hitman after him. We'll just kill a few 100,000 of his people, and then maybe he'll wither on the vine and die.
Some of his people will rise up and say, if the Americans don't stop killing us, we better kill Saddam.
Yeah, but if I were in that position, I would say, let's not have Saddam anymore. You folks go over there and take care of it. We'll save a few 100,000 lives. How many did you say they anticipated killing in that war?
Well, I don't know what you could say, but we know that they, or at least reported that they sent over in one shipment. There were two reports. One was, I think there was one report of 14,000, what they called human remains containers. They said they didn't send that many. I think the one solid number was 15,000. So you assume they expected 15,000 dead if they sent that many body bags. And they also had 20,000 medics. And if you have one medic for every 5 casualties, you're talking about Bush being prepared to lose 20,000 people and maybe 100,000 casualties to accomplish whatever it is that he has accomplished. And to say, well, he didn't lose anything, you say, well, that's good news, but it wasn't in the range of his contemplation of what it would cost us in casualties if we went in.
To save one man. I really think that when a country is at war and there are no rules, Why do we impose upon ourselves the one rule that would prevent the war altogether? They did it with Lumumba in the Congo, I remember, and several instances where a person was going to threaten our country with very dire consequences. They eliminated them. You know, I'm a pacifist and I'm all those things, but what's with this? Why do we kill hundreds of thousands for some lousy little principle that somebody has
There were
done?
two other bad counts in Bush's background that I want to get in here.
Go
One,
ahead.
you shouldn't re-elect if I was been chairman of the Republican Party or of the Democratic Party. I mean, the chairmanship of the party is a different kind of function. It doesn't really prepare you for the kind of restrained and balanced judgment you expect from the president. And I had developed some secondary standards that one of which was you really shouldn't elect anyone who had either too much oxygen or too little, like an astronaut or somebody from the submarines, or a mountain climber or a heavy jogger, or a scuba diver. And there's evidence that Bush kind of overdoes the jogging, and Jimmy Carter, you know, had that seizure when he was jogging, and we know that John Glenn had some trouble with
Why do you care? Would you go into heavy mourning if some of these people did have a seizure?
Well, they recover, but I mean, you just try not to.
Of course, we've got quail waiting there.
Take these risks when you can anticipate them. And, but Bush, they said, oh, he's so experienced. But most of his experiences were bad. As I said, vice presidency doesn't really, it can destroy a person. 8 years of it. Even 4 years could do a lot of harm to a good man, if he was a good man.
They come out all right.
Well, they get elected, but it isn't always good. You know, Spiro Agnew he had, and Richard Nixon was a vice president. And the record isn't very good. And he was chairman of the Republican Party, which is not character building. And he was head of the CIA. All of these would not give you any basis for having confidence in his independence or his integrity or his character.
I suppose those are the kind of things you have to convince the American public of.
Well, but the press should have talked about it. They always say, oh, he's wonderfully experienced, head of the CIA. You say, man,
what kind of experience?
That's no good. And head of the Republican Party, that's no good. And vice president, what does that do? He went in there denouncing voodoo economics, and he came out 8 years later fully converted.
Do you know that one of the other things, why does a president or our national leadership have to lose their common sense? He could see, anybody could see that the Chinese were going to crack down on the kids in, was it Tiananmen Square? Mm-hmm. That was obvious. Time after time, right now we should be feeding the Russians, a nation of starving peasants with the bombs proliferating, and whoever takes that over, we don't know who they are. We've got a fairly decent group of people in charge. Why aren't we helping them? What's going on? Do we like war? Do we like this building of munitions and tearing them down and building them and tearing them down?
The Russian thing is, neglect of that is, I think, the most serious failure of this administration. Here's the chance to really pick up where World War II ended, you know, without the whole intervention of Stalin and all of that, and say, look, the Russians are our allies, and we've got a chance to stabilize, come close to stabilizing that whole area. And Bush is sending a special group to study whether we're going to lend them $1.2 billion to buy grain, you know. And you say, what's this all about? I told him I was coming over that I spoke at a Harry Truman group, saying we've come a long way from Harry Truman, who was president, said the buck stops here, to George Bush, who's our first no-fault president. And there were some things in between that sort of led to what it is, but it's a wholly new conception. It isn't a public conception, but to have a president holding the office saying, I'm going to hold this principally by not being held responsible. And there's some sort of side angles on this. I was reading Peggy Noonan's book. She did this Reagan thing, but she also did some speech writing for Bush in the campaign before she left. But she said that she sent her first manuscripts in, and whoever was controlling said, "Oh, you can't use sentences with the pronoun I in it, that George Bush doesn't like to say I." And he'll leave out whole sentences if you say, "I did something." And he would say you could say "we" occasionally. He would accept some responsibility if it was in a group which wasn't identified, "we." But he really got to liking statements that had no subject, like "got up this morning, went to work, moved to Texas, killed some people." And you couldn't tell whether he had done it or somebody else had done it, or whether it was just a question, "kill some people." It was in the void, you know. And that Bush liked this kind of depersonalized sort of language. And if he did, I would think that this is something for the psychiatrists and the politicians who are all
detaching of one from
Yeah,
responsibility.
yeah, that's right.
What is occurring. One of the other issues, of course, is that is the economy, the presidency and this economy. In your judgment, Senator, what's really wrong with the economy? And in your judgment, what can be done? What should be done?
Well, Miles, you know what's wrong with it, and I'll tell you what's wrong.
Well, there are many people unemployed. The poor are being left out. The rich are getting richer. Can you imagine, even locally here, the big fuss over raising the taxes, $500 on a person making over $171,000? It's a joke. I'm just lucky enough to get into that category now, and you can't even feel it. You can't even find it in your bank account. We gave away about $3 billion so that executives would be willing to come to Minnesota and develop our state. Of course, most of it went to executives who are already here.
Who had no place to go.
Yeah, it's upside down. We have learned selfishness from Ronnie Reagan. Our country is so rich, the scraps on our table, if we just saved them, would take care of so many problems in this world. On the tables of the wealthy, the middle class, so-called.
Well,
but we've all learned that we should not pay taxes. The joke, the paucity of money for government now is a cruel hoax.
we've accepted really and institutionalized a class that doesn't belong to our economic society. It's just easier to keep them in poverty or to have 5 or 6 million unemployed than to take the action that would be necessary to absorb them into a going society. And you get 80% of the people who come to be indifferent to this 20%. It can go on. It's like the decline of Rome. I was reading a commentary on the old Roman historians, and they were listing the conditions in Rome before the fall of the Republic. And it's shocking. They said, well, there were thousands then, we have millions of people who were in poverty, and they were being taken care of by bread and circuses, and we do it with relief and television, you know, and whatever other. There was a tremendous burden of debt that the people could not carry. The interest load was such that they were overwhelmed by it. They said the veterans' benefits they were paying to the military people were a tremendous burden on society. They were conducting military adventures which had no justification. And in all of this, they said the wealthy people were utterly indifferent to the state of society, and the Republic fell and was replaced by the Caesars. I don't see quite that happening to us, but it's indicative of a most serious disorder. And you know, you watch the television ads, they say, you know, the big word is in America, an Italian observer wrote a few years back, is more. He said, I want more cereal, Mother, more interest, whatever it was, more and bigger automobiles, you know. And meanwhile, as Miles Evu indicated, the whole disorder of the economy, the national debt is up to about $4 trillion now, and the imbalance of payment running, and the burden of interest on individuals and on society is so great we can hardly carry it. And we just go on as though nothing could happen.
One of the things that I can't help but bringing up again is to dislodge Stalin and to change the regime and to make a democracy out of the Soviet Union, we would have spent $300 or $400 billion and hundreds of lives to do it if we could have done it. Now it's there for free, and we can't raise $2 billion to feed the people, so that this...
Even to lend them, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of that is, you touched on that, this idea of need versus greed. Are you better off today than you were yesterday? And the constant posing of that question and the separating of those who have from those who have not.
That's right.
And once one gets locked into that way of thinking, it's difficult to dislodge it. But you're quite correct that that whole Eastern bloc, the whole Soviet bloc, the opportunity that's there for us to step in, for this nation to step in and share in the democratization,
We could do a lot. If we were in better economic condition, we could do a lot more. Yes. But you know, it's like $700 billion savings and loan loss, and we can absorb it, or we think we can. But you couldn't do $1.5 billion or $2 billion in loans to the Russians for food. Well, this crazy stuff like when Getty sold his oil business to Pennzoil, they said, "You're worth $3 billion," and he said, "Okay, you got me for $3 billion." Texaco came along and said, "No, you're worth $6 billion." And they got, and the judge in Texas said, "No, you're worth $12 billion." Now here was Getty, who evidently had property worth $12 billion. If we had moved in and taxed $9 billion away from him for the good of society, he still would have had the $3 billion, which was all he thought he had. And if you take it from somebody who doesn't know he had it, he can't complain very much, you know.
True.
And then the stock market crashed. If we'd moved in on the stock market before it crashed and said, "Look, there's $1 trillion in this market that isn't there, so we're going to take it now because you don't have it anyway, you just think you have, and we're going to apply that on the national debt." The market crashed in October, and they lost $1 trillion anyway. We just been a little smarter. We could have picked it up before the crash.
A little smarter the day earlier.
Applied it on the national debt, and the debt would have been reduced by $1 trillion, and society would have been much better off.
Well, so the time is running out on us, but I just don't want to leave this discussion without having the opportunity to just talk very, very briefly about Politics 92. What do you see out there? What do you see at a presidential election? There are a lot of interested parties, some not so interesting. What do you see?
I don't know. Miles is looking at that more closely than I am.
Well, I've looked closely at this run for the presidency. I think I'll probably run Gene again.
How about that?
He's trying to break Harold Stassen's record, only this time Stassen brought something to the public in running, and maybe he didn't win.
Well, actually, the first 3 times he ran, he was right at every count.
Right.
The first time he said he could get elected over Dewey, and he could have. The second time he said he'd make a better president than Eisenhower, and he could have. And the third time he said get rid of Richard Nixon. After that, it got a little vague, but
see, if Senator McCarthy would run, he contribute something to the national debate. I don't know whether he could win or not, but he would change the way people think. He'd refresh the ideas and enrich the whole process, because it's certainly dismal as it is right now.
this is the closest thing I've come to a nomination so far this year.
I got to nominate at the convention.
Yeah,
I've never done that.
You can do that, Miles. I make you a commitment. If we run, you can nominate me.
Okay.
Is that all right?
If I don't get stage fright.
Yeah. I think worry a little bit about what you might say, but it'll take a chance.
Well, I would just think that it would be a very interesting debate, a very interesting opportunity for Americans to revisit on some of the values that are really at the heart and soul of this nation. So,
you know, on the record, I have run against 2 Yale men and defeated them.
Well,
I beat, he challenged me for the House, Roger Kennedy III. You could always tell a Yale man, they always were called the third. And then Wheelock Whitney III ran against me for the Senate, so I've been working up. I could beat a Yale man for the House and for the Senate.
all rich people do that. They worship their ancestors.
I could take on Bush, because I know the methodology of the Yale man in politics. But he's not the third, which makes it a little more difficult.
I think we've got about as close as we're going to get to a nomination.
And an acceptance.
And acceptance. Here on Telstar News. This has really been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to talk with you, to get some of your views expressed. I think the American public's going to be richer because of it. And Judge, I really welcome the opportunity to explore this further in the future, Senator, and hopefully we can have you back for another discussion.
Well, the pay is good.
The pay is great.
Well, we'll make a commitment to, if this starts this thing, we'll come back and appear with you regularly.
Excellent, excellent. You've heard it here first. Thank you very much. This is Bill Wilson for Tellstar News.